Okay, we are recording. I am Brandon Polite, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, and I'm joined by James Harold, who is Professor of Philosophy and Chair of the Philosophy Department at Mount Holyoke College in South Hadley, Massachusetts. James, thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure. I'm not used to hearing my name or my institution pronounced with such enthusiasm and energy as you just did.
Well, I'm glad to be of service. Um, awesome. Well, James, we're talking about this recent line of work that you've been developing on fan responses to works of art, and not in terms of like whether they like it or dislike it, but fans doing stuff with art or to art, right? Fan edits of films or fan fiction, set in worlds created by famous authors and so forth. And so you have this terrific paper in the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism that came out last year in 2022 called On Resisting Art. And also you have this amazing piece. I mean, they're both amazing, but I kind of like the Phantom Edit one slightly better given the subject matter and given I have Chewbacca on my shirt.
Oh, I didn't notice.
Yeah. We
Excellent.
got Chewie there with hold on, let me stand up, with Oscar the Grouch. So
Oh, wow. And where did you acquire that shirt?
my wife found it. Like
Awesome.
some, graphic designer online was selling it. And so she's like,
Total
cool.
fan art. There you
Yeah.
go.
But yeah, exactly. Right. So yeah, I came prepared today, at least sartorially. But yeah, you have this piece called The Phantom Edit, which came out in Bloomsbury Contemporary Aesthetics Library this year, 2023, which also featured my piece on Taylor Swift, which we can talk about because it sort of relates.
There's definitely common ground. Yeah.
If you feel like it. But we're talking about works of art based on works of art by other people, right? And so I guess the first, maybe most basic question is, in thinking about derivative artworks, right? What is their value? Because I think a lot of people's attitude is that fan art, fan fiction, fan edits, they're unoriginal, right? They're taking someone else's stuff and doing with it. And because it's unoriginal, there's this norm that originality matters. Therefore, it's assumed that these things must be bad because they're unoriginal, right? And so could you just briefly talk us through like your thoughts on the value of these things, right? And whether it's problematic that they're unoriginal.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's one answer to the originality challenge that I think is pretty tempting. But ultimately I don't want to go with it because I think it's a little too quick and easy. And that really tempting answer to the originality question is, well, no artwork is really ever original. And originality was never really a virtue of art in the first place that we should have cared about. So, I mean, you had mentioned The Death of the Author and Roland Barthes' essay, right? And part of the idea behind that essay is that all an author really is a kind of synthesis of their influences into some apparently new but really just kind of rearranged format, right? Originality doesn't really exist, therefore all art is fan art in a way. Everything is a fan edit. It's not exactly that I think that's completely wrong. I think it's a little too quick and a little too simplistic. And I do think there are differences of degree, right, in terms of how much synthesis and how much labor and how much work goes into the creation, right, of a particular work of art. And so I'm not completely anti-originality. So I would instead go with some other virtues that fan art and fan fiction and fan edits and all these kinds of things have. And I'll mention two. I don't think these are the only ones, but one is something that the author Michael Chabon, who is a fan of fan fiction and also an author of fan fiction, has talked about, which is the way in which fan fiction both responds to an invitation and also offers an invitation. So this is also a little bit, yeah, I won't go there right now. So the response to the invitation, right, is the idea that, you know, you read a novel or you watch a movie and you that movie or that novel invites you to think about things that go beyond just the narrative, to think about other things in that fictional world, the backstory of the main character, who is that minor character that showed up, where is this place on the map that's alluded to uh, but never actually shown. What's a power converter and why does Luke Skywalker want to pick one up? Never explained, never mentioned. Why is that milk blue, right? These are things that just appear and they awaken curiosity in the audience. So fan art responds to that kind of invitation, but it also extends an invitation because fan art is, and this is the second thing, community building. Not always, not in every case, but often. Fan communities have their origins in fan conventions, right? Physical gatherings of dozens, hundreds, or tens of thousands of people, right? Who share their enthusiasm and share t-shirts like the ones you're wearing with one another, which inspire other people to do riffs and variations and improvisations along what they've done. So there is this invitation that gets that value of artistic productivity and creativity. And then there is the value of the communities themselves that are created by responding to those invitations and giving those invitations, where people connect with one another. They may or may not continue to actually make things together. They may just, you know, learn to form new friendships, to use those relationships to understand and engage with the work better, more richly, more deeply than they originally had. So I think those two virtues, the invitation to creativity and community, would compensate for whatever shortcomings there might be with respect to originality.
Yeah, I love that. And yeah, originality ain't all that important. If it were, and I guess, there are a lot of directions we could go with that point. So maybe let's stick with the creativity line for a bit, right? That the movie, the novel, the series of books, whatever, inspires you to think more about it and inspires you to think more about it with other people, right? So it's not just, like in a classroom setting where you read the book and then you talk about it and you try to offer competing interpretations of it. It's, oh, there's, in Lord of the Rings, which is an example that you use, right? J.R.R. Tolkien drew maps that go at the beginning of the books, right? And not every place in those maps is explored in the novels, right? And so, ooh, what the hell is this place? What's going on there? Or maybe it's alluded to, right, obliquely. And yeah, and so it engenders this creative impulse to imagine what's going on there. And then you have these competing imaginings, right, that develop within the fan community. And so could you talk a bit more about that? Because I think that's really fantastic.
Uh, Absolutely. But first, I want to make sure that I'm giving credit where credit is due. So that point about maps is in a wonderful essay by Michael Chabon called Maps and Legends. And yes, he's talking about Lord of the Rings, and he's talking about the exact point you made, that there are points on the map, things indicated that are never visited, right, at any point during the story that make you wonder. And he also talks about the fact that the map also indicates that there are other things beyond the borders of the map, right, that are not even illustrated on the map, right? And that prompts our imagination. And Tolkien himself called this process, he called it world creation, right? This idea of creating a fictional world with a fictional backstory. I mean, Tolkien took it to an extreme that very few other artists have ever One would say that primarily he was interested in creating languages and histories, and only secondarily in telling stories, right? Uh, but when an author does this, or even sketches or suggests, right, that there's more than is contained in the narrative, then what it can do is to prompt people to both, audience members to both kind of fight with one another sometimes about which interpretation is the correct interpretation. Where are those blue wizards and who are they? Nerding out on Lord of the Rings a little bit here, right? Right, and people will come up with different and rival interpretations and try to marshal textual evidence, right, for their support. But it can also push people into a collaborative, creative mode and embrace multiple possibilities, right, where there are many different versions or improvisations on the fictional world that the author has, they might think of as the primary fictional world. Subcreation, fictional subcreation was his term for this, Tolkien's term, sorry.
Yeah, that's awesome,
Yeah.
right? And so on the community building side, right? So it prompts creativity, and that creativity can feed into these, communities. Ted Cohen refers to them as affective communities, right? But it's, people enjoying things together and thinking about them together. And as you're describing, creating things together and creating competing things together, right?
Mm-hmm.
That, multiple versions within fanfic, some of which become fanon, right? Canon within
Right.
the fanfic community, and others are more like peripheral or non-fanonical, I guess is what we'd call them. But
I
yeah,
don't know
so
I've ever heard that term before. I like it.
I mean, if there's fanon, then
right.
there's fanonicity, right?
Right.
So yeah, so could you talk a bit more about the community stuff, because like that's
Yeah.
really rich and interesting.
So I want to acknowledge on the question of community the fact that it can be quite positive, but it needn't be. And it can also be quite negative sometimes. And there's a lot of ways in which it can be negative, but I'll say a little bit more on the positive side, but I don't want to suggest that it always or even generally, right? I don't know. That's more of an empirical question, right? Leads us towards this positive. I think it must, on balance, be good, or else people would stay away from it more. But it can be quite toxic as well. So, I mean, first, I think you look at an example I like from high literature, which is Bloomsday, this annual celebration on June 16th, where people from all over the world travel to Dublin. I mean, there are other celebrations too, but the big one is in Dublin to celebrate James Joyce's birthday, celebrate James Joyce, and to celebrate specifically Ulysses, because that is the day, June 16th, on which the narrative of Ulysses takes place, right? And you'll have people dress up and they do readings from Ulysses, but it also becomes a larger celebration of James Joyce's other works, and it becomes a celebration of Dublin, which people think that's what, Ulysses is in a way. And there's this joy, right, in discovering and being with people who love the same things you love. So that's just one very straightforward, I think, positive value of community. And we're not even here really talking about the creation of fan art yet, although some of that happens in the costuming and the songs, right, and that kind of thing that go along with Bloomsday. But just merely being together can bring that value. And of course, I don't want to deny that can happen virtually as well, right? Online gatherings, discovering when you're into something relatively obscure, right, that someone else, that's their favorite album or their favorite track on some obscure album, the same as yours, is just delightful, right? But there's also this fascinating fact about fan fiction in particular, but I also think this is true with fan edits of songs and things like that, is just how collaborative they often are. If you look at the online repositories for, fanfic, people will post works in progress and people make comments and they make suggestions. You should push it this way. This is what should happen. And even if it's not fully co-authored, people are constantly incorporating, and there's a whole conversation going on while fan fiction is being written. And so you get this exciting fact of almost spontaneous artistic collaboration that can happen in these fan spaces. And that is something that doesn't exist in a lot of authorized collaborations. I mean, except for certain genres like jazz, that kind of thing, where collaborative improvisation is part of the tradition. So I think that's really thrilling. It's lovely to see when somebody posts a version of a pop song or a mashup, and that gets traction. One of the first things that happen is someone will re-edit that edit, right? Someone will add something to it or subtract something, or TikTok being probably the most accelerated version of this trend. But that's collaborative art making in action. And as an esthetician, as someone who cares about art, and how can we not celebrate that kind of communal art making, right? Regardless of whether or not it fulfills some particular standard of originality, it clearly brings forward other values that we should care about.
Yeah, awesome. And so, that sort of segues nicely, I think, into the next question I had, which has to do with the authors themselves, right? That the authors generally aren't authorizing, right, other people to make work in the fictional universes that they created with their intellectual property, to use, a legal term, right? And so, whereas someone like J.R.R. Tolkien seemed to be like, it's kind of going to be awesome. Other people are going to tell stories that I didn't have time to tell or wasn't interested in telling. Whereas conversely, someone like George Lucas has historically wanted to kill all of that stuff, right? Even though it's what's kept the love of Star Wars alive over the years, right? Is all of these unauthorized works created by fans who, may be amateur storytellers or maybe really good storytellers, right? And so I guess the question here is, what power does the author have, and or what power should the author have over their works and the universes they've created?
So George Lucas is always the the enemy here, and I want to give his argument its due, because I think, and it took me a little while to kind of uncover this, but I think what Lucas is interested in protecting is not as self-centered as has often been portrayed. So back in the 80s and 90s, I could look up the exact date, I don't recall. Some people who are my age or older might remember that there was a colorization craze that was going on, where old black and white films were being colorized. And there was this idea that, companies like Warner Brothers could reinvigorate interest in their old back catalog. People didn't want to watch black and white movies, but if you colorized them, then people would, want to see them. And in some cases, and I don't know how common this was, but in some cases, the master would be ruined during this process. So you'd lose the original black and white print, right? And that would no longer be there. George Lucas testified before Congress because he was so upset about this. And he wasn't upset about his films, which were not in black and white. Well, I don't know, maybe his student films were, but that's not what he was talking about. He was talking about the films that he was raised on, right? The serials of the 1930s, the film noirs of the 40s, the films, black and white films that he loved. And he was concerned about historical preservation. There were these great filmmakers who had made these works that were now being irrevocably altered by corporations 50 years later that were simply trying to make a buck. And in the process, something irretrievable was going to be lost. That led him to a view, and I think a lot of other artists have this view, that it's really important that the artist maintain control, right, of their own creation, and artists themselves can go back, right, and make a change if they choose to. But other people should not be authorized to make alterations to historically significant works. Right? Now that, I think, argument has a certain amount of plausibility, particularly, I think, when the process is going to damage the original, right? So the original will be lost. I think it's harder to support Lucas's argument when you lose that piece of it, right? So when Mike Nichols makes the Phantom Edit, the very first sort of major re-editing of a Hollywood studio film, obviously not the first one ever, but the first sort of wildly successful of these. When he did that, he worked with a VHS copy that he had at home. He wasn't working with the sort of, master or original or anything that could be damaged. In no way is the version of the Phantom Menace that Lucas cared about, has that ever been placed under threat by fan activity? So then you have to go to a secondary argument that I don't think it's as strong, which is namely that the value in the marketplace of the original gets diluted by the presence of all these alternate edits. And again, I think there are some important claims here, right? You wouldn't want any deceit, right? You wouldn't want copies of the Phantom Edit to be passed around and pretend that they are the Phantom Menace. Apparently this did happen with one of the Harry Potter books at one point. In China, a company or an individual, I'm not sure, put out what was supposed to be the next Harry Potter book in the series. And while they were still waiting for Rowling to write it, and sold a lot of copies before the word got out that no, this is not actually, that's deceitful, and so that leads people on. That's not a good thing to do. But I just think the question of whether the value really gets diluted it's really not clear to me. As you suggested, I think t-shirts like the ones you're wearing and the presence of all of these alternate edits and all of the fan art in the Star Wars world is one of the things that has kept Star Wars going as a concern for 50 years. It's kind of incredible. I mean, it's no longer Lucas that's involved now, right? Since he sold everything to Disney. But I think that there is a benefit. There are cases I could worry about. There are cases I could worry about where you have artists who aren't as powerful or as well known as Lucas, who create something valuable and then an edit or a variant or a fan version becomes more popular than the original, and the original gets kind of forgotten or lost. And there have been some cases like that. And there, I think we do need, I don't know whether we need legal regulation, but certainly as a society, we need to attend to cases like that and make sure that original artists aren't lost. But people like Lucas, I don't think we need to worry about so much. Yeah, that's my kind of, I don't know if you want me to talk a little bit more about some of the cases where I think artists were or may have been harmed, right, by some of these riffs.
Yeah, so what would an example of that be?
So Matt Fury created this character, Pepe the Frog, in a web comic. And the character was a stoner stereotype, basically. His trademark expression was feels good man. And for some reason, who knows, stills of that web comic featuring Pepe the Frog saying feels good man became a meme, a popular meme. And through a long and interesting process. There's actually a documentary film about this called Feels Good Man. There's also a really good podcast episode documenting how this happened. It was eventually seized by the alt-right, and it was infused with Nazi propaganda. And eventually, Pepe the Frog was declared a hate symbol right alongside swastikas and this kind of thing. And Matt Fury eventually wrote that he was discontinuing the character. He was completely disillusioned by what had happened, and he found that this misappropriation and kind of these variant fan versions that had this right-wing Nazi ideology attached to them undermined his ability to make the character and have it mean what he wanted it to mean. Now, this is a case of an independent artist working relatively obscurely independently, and the character just, what is done with the character completely runs away from them. So that is a case I think we should be concerned about. And I think that's a case where I am sympathetic to the artist's rights, which is not the same as saying I know exactly what the proper response is. I'm not sure how we as a society can collectively prevent that from happening without imposing legal regulations that might do a lot of other things we don't want to happen. So I'm not saying I have a solution, but I do acknowledge that's a problem and something we should worry about.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. Thank you. So, I mean, we're talking about like the politics of this, right? And the economic side of this as well. And, you mentioned when talking about George Lucas that this isn't a problem for him because he's a multi-billionaire, right? And he partly became that by selling Lucasfilm and the rights to the Star Wars films and that intellectual property to Disney, right? Which has done all sorts of things to it. And so there's, our initial question that led to this was, what sort of power can or should the artist have over their works? But now we have this corporate thing, right?
Yes,
and so,
good.
George Lucas doesn't have power over Star Wars anymore. Disney does. And they get to dictate what's canonical and what's non-canonical. And so the first thing they did was said all the expanded universe stuff, not canonical. It doesn't count.
Although they're
incorporating,
moving a lot of that stuff back in, but yes.
Yeah, into their various properties, right? Do you have thoughts on like what role the corporations should have in like dictating what counts as an instance of a work of art, or what the meanings of works of art created by the people whose stuff they bought, right, or was made for them? Like, do you have thoughts on that topic?
That's a really good question. I do. Can I say one other quick thing first? Sure. That your question made me think of. One separate worry I have about corporations interacting with fandom is pandering. So the nice thing about Lucas controlling Star Wars, you might say, is that he was always putting forward his vision. You might hate it, you might love it, but he was doing what he thought was fun and interesting and important and fit with his vision of the world. And then fans were taking the parts that they liked and saying, no, Han shot first, and they were doing their own versions. And it led to this. I think that's a great situation. The artist gets to do exactly what they want, and then the audience gets to do what they want. One thing that happens when you get corporate control is you get pandering. So one example of this that I always think of is there had been a lot of criticism of the Marvel movies, and still is, but for years, of not featuring enough women as central characters rather than romantic interests or supporting characters. And this is a criticism that Marvel Studios clearly heard. And then in Avengers Endgame, you have this infamous scene where they gather every female character who has ever appeared in every movie somehow in one shot. There's no explanation or narrative reason why they would all be together, and it's just this hero shot, and then they're all fighting alongside one another even though they don't know one another. Complete pandering, right? This is a major corporation who has heard the complaints, right, of the fans and responded in a way that just makes the artwork worse, and doesn't at all satisfy, right, what it is the fans were looking for. But that temptation to pander, which we've seen a lot of high profile cases, is, I think, one of the dangers, right, of corporate control, right, of these kinds of creative properties. It's not to say individual artists can't pander, but the temptation for massive corporations to do so is very, very strong. As far as corporations determining what's canon, I mean, I'm not a philosopher of law, and I don't have good training here. Darren Hick is the person for sure who knows about this way more than I do. I am uncomfortable with corporations having the same artistic ownership rights as artists. At the same time, I recognize the complications of trying to do away with that. And this is the legal system that we have and that we're kind of stuck with. At the same time, I'm not too worried about corporate control of what is canon, as long as there is freedom to make fanon, right? And again, if you go back to Lucas, a lot of people hate some of the choices that he made. I hate some of the choices that he made. And then they're able to just create alternate versions and circulate it, and share it with other people and enjoy it. So as long as we're not stopping fans from making their own versions of canon, then the fact that corporations get to have the power to say what and what is not canon may be a price we have to pay.
Yeah, awesome. And what you just said reminded me of something that I think ties several of our points together, which is fans banding together not to create something new, but rather to recreate or reproduce something with the example of the despecialized editions of the original trilogy, right? George Lucas releases the special editions in the 90s. Lots of fans hate them because the CGI isn't good compared to the original stop motion stuff. It adds scenes that detract from it. There's the god-awful musical number in Return of the Jedi that replaces the original, which was great, fine as it was, right? And so, a group of fans banded together to reproduce the originals and, make them for HD, right? And so, yeah, there's fans doing not necessarily creative work, but recreative work.
Yeah.
Right. To reproduce something that already existed, which George Lucas denied them by refusing to release the original versions of the trilogy.
Yeah, I think that's a terrific example. And there's something a little bit ironic there with Lucas being so upset about the original black and white versions of classic Hollywood films either being damaged or not being made available publicly anymore. And then his doing the same thing with his original versions of the 1970s and 80s Star Wars movies, which you can only get, well, before the despecialized versions, you could only get in like VHS quality versions. That is interesting. So is that creative activity? I mean, it's certainly not in the sense of creating anything original, because the goal is fidelity, right? That's what they're going for. They want it to look the way that the best 35 millimeter prints looked in 1977, right? That's the goal, right? Is fidelity to some historical artifact. And in that way, it's like an ecological restoration, or a restoration of an old artwork, right? Like, as much as possible. I think it is artistically a very impressive activity, right? When you do that kind of thing successfully, no question. And the fact that it's collaborative brings that value of community together. But then you also have, I don't know if you've seen any of these, but there's also a version of the original 1977 Star Wars, shot for shot recreated and crowdsourced.
Yeah.
So they just broke it up into, I forget how long, very short clips, 60 seconds or something like that. And people just finding stuff around their house. It is so much fun to watch, so much fun. And of course, their fidelity is unachievable as a goal, right? The actors playing the roles keep shifting every minute or two. But they keep the dialogue, they bring this incredible enthusiasm. And again, it's a group of people working together to create something, to recreate something that they love in a new way.
Yeah, that's awesome, right? And so George Lucas's attitude has to be that the artist has an absolute right to their art, right? And so I get to change it, no one else does, right?
Right. Lucas, when Lucas was in charge,
Yeah.
was not as litigious as people feared. So I don't know for sure how much he was bothered by the mere existence of different versions, but he certainly didn't like them being circulated and publicized, and absolutely didn't want them to be sold for profit, right? Which is, of course, again, legally the bright line that is the hardest to cross, right? So I don't want to vilify Lucas too much, but yes, I mean, according to the things he said to Congress, he really, really believes that the artist is the one who gets to decide whether or not to destroy, what version of that work. And that in itself, I think, raises questions. Kafka wanted all of his manuscripts destroyed, and most of us are very happy that Max Brod did not do that, right? And so we have a lot more of Kafka's works than we would otherwise. And Dickinson, right, did the same thing. Her sister preserved her poetry against her wishes. So sometimes I think the value of the work, the original work, that 1977 version of Star Wars or Emily Dickin's poetry, might be more valuable than protecting the right of the artist to determine whether or not a particular version of a work gets to be released to the public. Yeah, although I think there are hard cases there.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Can I turn, so because of one of the cases you've been interested in, like if Taylor Swift had her way, would the original versions of the albums that she's been re-recording still be available? Obviously, she doesn't have that legal power, right? But it seems like the answer would be no, right? That she would not want the original Red to be available for purchase.
Yeah, I mean, I think the case is really complicated because in some sense, I think what she wants is the masters to the originals, right? If she were to
but she can't get that.
She can't get those, right? If she were able to get them, one question I've had while thinking about this for the last year plus is if she were able to get them now, would she stop the re-recording project, right? She just announced today, right, as of this recording, the 1989 Taylor's version's coming out in October, right? A couple of months from now. And, if she were just given them today or given the option to buy them today, she absolutely would. She'd take them, right? I still think she'd do the next two, right? I think she'd release 1989 Taylor's version, and then I think she'd do Reputation, then the debut album, right? I think she would continue with that project because it's been so successful. I mean,
and she's adding all this, she's not just reproducing them. She's bringing songs back from the vault, and she's doing variant versions and things.
Yeah. So I think she'd still do it. But yeah, your question of would she want them to go away entirely, right? If she had the power, could she delete them from existence? I honestly don't know, because I think she's still deeply attached to them, which makes sense, right? They're a part of her history. She produced those as a teenager into her early 20s, into late 20s.
I mean, I wouldn't want them to go away. I'm not a particularly, I'm a semi fan of Taylor Swift. I pick things up for my kids. There's certain songs I really love, but I wouldn't want them to go away. In a way, this brings us back around, because your first question was about the value of originality. Right? And I do think that originality as a characteristic or property of art might be overvalued, but originals
Yeah.
as an object or as a set of objects, these are things that I think it is important to care about, and I think Lucas is right about that. And I suspect you're right that Taylor Swift wouldn't want her originals destroyed or to vanish from
Yeah.
the earth, and certainly she shouldn't, and we shouldn't. And even if there are good reasons to listen to Taylor's version of these old recordings rather than the originals, the existence of the originals and the preservation of the originals, I think, has historical, artistic value that is worth preserving.
Yeah. And I think further, right? If you bought the CD prior to 2019, I think she's fine with you listening to it.
Yeah,
Right. Her problem is that someone else is making money off of her work
right.
without her consent. Right.
Right.
And in particular, Scooter Braun, this person who, she's accused of years of bullying and manipulation, et cetera. Right. That's the problem. So I think there's a few things, right? One, that had her record label and thus her back catalog been purchased by someone other than him, she might not be doing this. Right. So that's one issue. But then, yeah, I think the other one is, yeah, it's the fact that other people, and this person in particular, is making money off of her is the problem. So if you bought it prior to the selling of Big Machine Records, listen to it. If you downloaded it on your iPhone, right? If you still have an iPod with those on it, continue to listen, but don't buy them now and don't stream them now. Right. And so what does that mean? How can you access them then if you don't have it? Well, buy used copies or download them illegally. Right. Like, those are your options. And, I don't know if she would endorse publicly, you know, buy it illegally, right? Download it illegally, but maybe she'd be cool with that. It'd be
It might
better.
be,
Yeah, it'd be
yeah.
better.
The Scooter Braun point, I think, gets back to another theme, which is that when we think about fans creating alternate versions of artists' work, now Scooter Braun is not a fan, but he's someone who's profiting from Taylor Swift's work. We care about who they are and what moral purposes they're up to. So are they appropriating a character from webcomic in order to promote fascism, right? And Nazi ideology? If that's what they're doing, then that matters. If, on the other hand, they're doing it to build community, to have fun, to be creative, to do a version of Star Wars where Han shoots first, just as he did in 1977, or if they're trying to take a work of art and make it anti-racist, right? Try to make moral improvements to a work, then we have every reason to feel differently about that kind of activity than activity that puts money in the hands of people who shouldn't, right, be making a profit from that work, or who are looking to put that work to questionable purposes. So it's a messy matter from a moral and political point of view. I don't think we want to just universally celebrate as an unconditional good the creation of variants and fan edits and fan arts and even artists redoing their old back catalog in new ways. It always has that potential to be creative and exciting and community building, but there's a dark side that's there as well.
Yeah, right. And I think, going back to the Phantom Edit, right? Part of the reason it was successful is because it was good, right?
Right.
The people who
Right.
saw it, which I don't think either of us have seen it, but the people who saw it thought it was much better than George Lucas's version, right? Whereas if it had been worse, we wouldn't be talking about it 20 years later, right? 20 plus years later.
Yeah. Yeah. I have seen other edits. The most interesting case here, and it's one I talk about in the Phantom Edit piece that you referred to, in terms of aesthetic success, is Raising Cain. So this is an old Brian De Palma film, which, like many studio stories, the version that was eventually released was not one that De Palma had authorized or that he was happy with. De Palma, however, never, I don't know if he didn't want to or didn't have time to, but he never went back and did a director's cut of Raising Cain. But a fan did. A fan named Pete Gelderblom did an edit of Raising Cain according to public statements that De Palma had made about what he wanted. And he sent it to De Palma, and De Palma said, fantastic. This is the version of Raising Cain that people should watch. So this is almost the anti-Lucas story, right? So De Palma is telling people, if you want to watch Raising Cain, don't watch the studio version with my name on it. Watch this unauthorized, unofficial fan edit version that's floating around. And the reasons, again, it's not about politics here. As far as I know, it's not like a Scooter Braun situation. It's just, this is better. This is a better version of the work, right? And it's not, and you should watch this one because this is the one that I would have made had things been different, or it's close to that anyway. I think that's a fascinating case, but that kind of case is super rare.
Yeah.
Right?
And and interestingly, what you just said was exactly what George Lucas said with the special editions, right? If I had had the ability, this is the movie I would have made, right? The cantina scene, these were like, Halloween costumes. And so I'm going to CGI in new aliens, right? To make it look better, right? The Mos Eisley, the spaceport, we didn't get to see it in the original. Why? Because we didn't have money for it.
They didn't have
now
enough
you get to see it.
extras, and they didn't have enough costumes and things like that.
Yeah, right. And so it's interesting here, right?
True,
that the same sort of argument that George Lucas made is the same sort of argument Brian De Palma's making.
Right.
But the difference is precisely ownership, right? That George Lucas released the version of Star Wars that he did because that's the version that was best available to him then, right? And I guess further too, right? The difference is, the additions, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm guessing the fan edit of Raising Cain didn't add a bunch of stuff, post-production wise. It just probably just cut together what was there available on like the cassette tape.
I haven't seen it. I should, because I'm curious about it. But I would assume not, unless he was working with De Palma or somehow had access
to deleted
he had to work with what he had, right, raw material wise. But that is a really interesting comparison that you make, and I think it gets down to differences in opinion about what makes for the best version. And I think the best principle in general here is something like "Let a Thousand Flowers Bloom." Let's have Lucas's version. Let's have Mike Nichols' version of let's have the 1977 version. Let's have all these versions out there. Let's then get a community together to have a discussion about, why do you like this one better? What are the advantages? I actually agree with Lucas. There are some improvements in the special editions. There are some things that look better, that look a little, that cantina, not the cantina scene, but the Mos Eisley shots look pretty barren in 1977. It does not look like a big city. It looks like a desert with a couple of buildings and a few people wandering around, right? So I'm not unsympathetic, right? And I think having all the versions out there and allowing fans to engage in argument and discussion and analysis, and then go on and create a new hybrid version that has some bits of Lucas's version and some bits of 1977. Why not? Again, I don't think we should be deceitful. I think we should preserve originals. I think that the authorized version should always be labeled as such. The authorized version, we should always know what it is we're dealing with. But I think there's an enormous benefit to creative community activity, to having all of these different versions available to us. It's a wonderful thing.
Awesome. Well, I think we'll end it on that note. So James, thank you so much. This was a really fantastic discussion.
I really enjoyed it, Brandon. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Awesome.